So, you want to own a big pharma company. You decided to enter the pharmaceutical industry. You are going to invent a new drug, cure a terrible disease, and make a mountain of cash in the process. It sounds like a noble and highly profitable venture, right? It is a world of astronomical financial risks, billions of dollars in speculative scientific research, and the constant, terrifying ticking clock of patent expirations. If you have ever looked at the staggering price of a prescription drug at the pharmacy counter and wondered exactly where all that money goes, or if you are simply fascinated by business models that require over a decade of upfront investment before seeing a single dime of profit, this is the deep dive for you. We are going to look at the entire economic life cycle of a pharmaceutical giant. We will travel from the microscopic discoveries on the laboratory floor all the way to the ruthless negotiations in the corporate boardroom and figure out exactly how the math works when you are in the business of curing human diseases. Owning a pharmaceutical company is not for the faint of heart. It requires a level of capitalization and risk tolerance that shuts out almost everyone except the absolute largest players in the global economy. Let us start with the foundation of the entire enterprise, which is research and development. Most people outside the industry think owning a pharma company is a lot like owning a legally protected license to print money. But the reality is much closer to running a high-stakes casino where you have to put down $1 billion just to sit at the table, and the house still has a 90% chance of taking all your chips. The pharmaceutical business model is inherently built on failure. For every single drug that actually makes it to the pharmacy shelf and into the hands of a patient, there are thousands of chemical compounds that failed in the initial lab assays, failed in animal testing, or failed in human trials. The commonly accepted figure in the industry is that it takes roughly $2.6 billion and over a decade of time to bring a single new drug to the market. But you have to understand that number is a little misleading. It does not literally cost $2.6 billion to develop one successful drug. That figure is fully loaded, meaning it includes the cost of all the monumental scientific failures along the way. When you own a big pharma company, your few successful drugs have to pay for the massive graveyard of hundreds of failed experiments. This is the first major economic hurdle you face as an owner. You have to convince institutional investors to give you billions of dollars to fund a massive pipeline of research, knowing full well that most of that research will result in absolutely nothing. You are funding entire armies of biochemists, building massive testing facilities, and renting supercomputers to analyze complex protein structures. You are burning through hundreds of millions of dollars a year in sheer overhead, and you might not have a commercial product to sell for another 10 to 15 years. This creates an enormous economic barrier to entry. You cannot just start a big pharma company in your garage or your dorm room like a consumer software startup. You need immense patient capital. You are playing a long game where the time value of money works against you every single day. Every dollar you spend on day one is a dollar that needs to generate a massive return 15 years from now just to break even on inflation and the opportunity cost of not investing that money elsewhere. Once you actually find a molecule that seems promising in a petri dish and in animal models, you enter the clinical trial phase, which is where the economics become even more punishing. As the owner of the company, this is where you really start sweating because the costs scale up exponentially. Clinical trials are broken down into 3 main phases, and each phase is a distinct, massive financial hurdle. Phase 1 is all about safety. You take a small group of healthy human volunteers, maybe 20 to 80 people, and you administer the drug simply to make sure it does not cause severe harm, sudden toxicity, or intolerable side effects. You are paying the volunteers, you are paying the specialized clinicians, and you are paying for incredibly strict round-the-clock medical monitoring. If the drug passes phase 1, you breathe a brief sigh of relief, but your balance sheet takes a significant hit. Now you enter phase 2, which tests for efficacy. Does the drug actually do what it is theoretically supposed to do? Now you need several hundred patients who actually suffer from the specific disease you are trying to treat. Finding these specific patients, enrolling them in the trial, and monitoring them over months or even years costs tens of millions of dollars. The failure rate here is absolutely brutal. This phase is known in the industry as the Valley of Death, where most experimental drugs die. They might be perfectly safe, but they just do not work well enough compared to a placebo to justify moving forward. If your compound somehow miraculously survives phase 2, you face the final boss of drug development, which is phase 3. Phase 3 trials require thousands of patients spread across multiple countries, hospitals, and specialized clinics to gather a statistically bulletproof dataset. You have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt to the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, the European Medicines Agency, and other global regulatory bodies that your drug is not only safe and effective, but statistically significant across a massive, diverse population. A single phase 3 trial can easily cost upwards of $500 million on its own. And remember, you are spending this staggering amount of money without any guarantee of a financial return. If the data at the end of a multi-year phase 3 trial comes back negative or even just mediocre compared to existing standard of care treatments, all that money is gone. Poof, it evaporates. Your stock price plummets, your investors revolt, and you have absolutely nothing to show for a decade of intense labor and massive capital expenditure. The risk profile is unparalleled in almost any other sector of the global economy. But let us look at the upside. Let us say you win the lottery. Your phase 3 data is absolutely incredible. The safety profile is completely clean, and the FDA formally approves your drug. Now, finally, you get to make money. This brings us to the core economic engine of Big Pharma, the patent monopoly. When your scientists first discover a new chemical entity, you file for a patent. This patent gives you the exclusive legal rights to manufacture and sell that specific drug in the United States for a period of 20 years. No one else can legally copy it. No one else can sell it. You are granted a legally enforced monopoly, which means you have enormous, unparalleled pricing power. This is the fundamental economic reason why some groundbreaking new therapies cost tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. You have to price the successful drug astronomically high to recoup the billions you spent on its specific development, pay for the dozens of other drugs that failed in the pipeline, and generate a massive market-beating profit for your shareholders to justify the insane financial risk they took in the first place. The entire modern industry is built on the blockbuster model, which relies on finding a drug that generates at least $1 billion a year in top-line revenue. But here's the catch. And from an operational standpoint, it is a massive one. That 20-year patent clock starts ticking the moment you file the patent paperwork, which usually happens in the very early stages of laboratory discovery. Because it takes 10 to 12 years to actually get the drug through the gauntlet of clinical trials and officially approved by the FDA, your effective monopoly time on the open market is usually only 8 to 10 years. You have exactly 1 decade to extract as much global revenue as humanly possible before the golden goose is effectively killed by competition. This creates an intense pressure cooker environment within the company. Every single day of delay in a clinical trial, every single week lost to regulatory red tape, is literally costing your company millions of dollars in lost monopoly time. It is a relentless, exhausting race against the calendar from the moment the patent is filed to the moment it expires. And we cannot forget about manufacturing. In the old days of the pharmaceutical industry, most drugs were small molecules, essentially simple chemicals synthesized in a lab, pressed into a pill, and put in a cheap plastic bottle. The manufacturing costs for these were incredibly low, yielding gross margins of 90% or more. But today, the economics have shifted heavily toward biologics. These are massive, incredibly complex molecules synthesized inside living cells, used to treat complex diseases like advanced cancer or severe autoimmune disorders. Manufacturing biologics requires massive bioreactors, pristine clean rooms, and incredibly delicate temperature controls. As an owner, building a single biologic manufacturing facility can cost over $1 billion before it produces a single vial of medicine. It completely changes the capital expenditure requirements of the business, forcing you to invest heavily in specialized supply chain infrastructure just to get the physical product out the door without it degrading. To maximize that short 10-year window of exclusivity, big pharma companies spend an absolute fortune on sales and marketing. It constantly surprises people outside the industry, but many large pharmaceutical companies routinely spend roughly the same amount, or sometimes even more, on selling and administering their drugs as they do on researching them. You have to build out and maintain a massive, highly compensated global sales force. These are the specialized pharmaceutical representatives who travel from hospital to hospital and clinic to clinic, educating doctors about the nuanced clinical benefits of your new drug, navigating complex medical networks, and ensuring your product is top of mind when a physician pulls out their prescription pad. You also have direct-to-consumer advertising, which is a massive line item on the corporate income statement. The United States and New Zealand are the only two major developed countries that legally allow this kind of direct television and print advertising, and it is incredibly lucrative. If you can spend millions on advertising to convince a patient to walk into a clinic and ask their doctor by name for your specific pill, your sales volume will skyrocket, providing a massive return on that advertising spend. But pricing the drug is a complex economic dance that goes far beyond slapping a price tag on a bottle. You are not just selling directly to the patient. You are negotiating with a convoluted, opaque web of private insurance companies, government programs like Medicare, and extremely powerful middlemen known as pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs. The PBMs act as the ultimate gatekeepers of the healthcare system. They decide whether your drug gets placed on their formulary, which is basically the VIP list of drugs that a patient's insurance will actually cover without exorbitant out-of-pocket costs. To secure a favorable tier on that formulary list, your company has to offer massive legally protected secret rebates and massive discounts back to the PBMs and the insurers. So the incredibly high list price you see reported on the evening news is rarely the actual net price the pharma company collects. It is a shadowy, highly negotiated system that adds massive administrative overhead to your business operations and constantly puts immense downward pressure on your actual realized revenue. The economics also get highly complicated when you look at the global market. The United States is essentially the profit engine for the entire global pharmaceutical industry. Because most European nations, Canada, and other developed countries have single-payer healthcare systems or strict government price controls, they aggressively cap how much they are willing to pay for your drug. As a big pharma owner, you will still sell your drug in Germany or Japan because the marginal cost of producing one extra pill is practically zero. So any revenue above the baseline manufacturing cost is pure profit. But you are absolutely forced to make the vast majority of your risk-adjusted returns in the United States, where the free market allows for much higher pricing. From a purely economic perspective, American consumers are effectively subsidizing the research and development costs for the rest of the world. Understanding this geographic dynamic is crucial for forecasting your global revenue models and keeping your company afloat. Now we reach the most terrifying phrase in the pharmaceutical vocabulary, the patent cliff. Remember that ticking 20-year clock? Eventually, time entirely runs out. The exact day your primary patent expires, your legal monopoly vanishes into thin air. Almost overnight, generic drug manufacturers who have been waiting patiently in the wings flood the market with exact chemical copies of your blockbuster drug. Because these generic companies did not have to spend billions of dollars on a decade of research and development, they can afford to sell the exact same pill for pennies on the dollar and still make a healthy profit. The economic impact on your company is devastating and immediate. When a major small molecule blockbuster drug goes off patent, the original manufacturer can lose up to 80 or even 90% of its market share and revenue for that specific drug within a matter of mere months. Billions of dollars in annual recurring revenue simply evaporate from the income statement, leaving a massive financial hole that you have to fill. If the drug is a biologic, those large, complex molecules manufactured in living cells that we talked about earlier, The patent cliff works a little differently, and this provides a massive economic advantage for modern pharma. Because biologics are so incredibly complex, generic companies cannot easily make an exact chemical copy. Instead, they make what are called biosimilars. These are highly similar, but not identical. Because they are not identical, the FDA requires biosimilars to go through their own expensive clinical trials to prove they are just as safe and effective as the original biologic. This creates a massive financial barrier to entry for the generic competitors. It costs them hundreds of millions of dollars just to launch a biosimilar, which means they cannot discount the price nearly as aggressively. Instead of an 80% drop in revenue overnight, a biologic facing biosimilar competition might only see a 30 or 40% erosion spread out over several years. This softer patent cliff is exactly why every big pharma company is aggressively pivoting its entire portfolio away from simple chemical pills and toward complex biologic therapies. The structural economics are vastly superior for long-term revenue protection. This existential threat of the patent cliff is also why pharma companies employ literal armies of patent lawyers to engage in a highly controversial economic strategy known as evergreening. As your primary patent nears expiration, your legal and research teams will try to make minor modifications to the drug to secure new, extended patents. Maybe you change the delivery mechanism from a standard capsule to a slow-release tablet. Maybe you combine it with another existing drug in the same pill. Maybe you find a slightly different chemical formulation that absorbs into the bloodstream 5% faster. If you can get the patent office to approve these secondary patents, you can sometimes artificially extend your monopoly for a few more crucial years, generating billions in extra revenue. It is a vital strategy for protecting your corporate cash flow, even if it draws immense criticism from healthcare advocates who argue it stifles generic competition and keeps prices artificially high. Because inventing entirely new drugs internally is so incredibly difficult, expensive, and risky, the modern economics of big pharma have fundamentally shifted over the last 2 decades. Today, the absolute biggest players do less and less of their own early-stage, ground-up discovery. Instead, they act much more like massive venture capital firms paired with global distribution networks. The actual risky early-stage science is increasingly done by small, nimble biotech startups, which are often spun out of university research labs and funded by private venture capital. These small companies take on the immense scientific and financial risk of phase 1 and phase 2 trials. If a small biotech startup actually gets highly promising phase 2 data, the big pharma companies swoop in like sharks. They will buy the biotech company outright for billions of dollars in a massive acquisition. Or they will sign highly lucrative licensing and co-development deals. When you acquire one of these promising biotech startups, you are rarely getting a bargain, because the startup has essentially de-risked the molecule by getting it through phase 2. The bidding war among big pharma companies can be incredibly fierce. You often have to pay a massive premium, sometimes 2 or 3 times the startup's public market valuation, just to win the deal. This introduces a new economic risk, which is goodwill and overpayment. If you buy a startup for $5 billion based on promising mid-stage data, and the drug subsequently fails in phase 3 under your watch, you have to write off that entire $5 billion investment. This is a massive hit to your corporate earnings and can easily lead to activist investors demanding a change in leadership. As an owner, your capital allocation skills, knowing exactly when to buy, how much to pay, and when to walk away from a bidding war are just as critical to the survival of the company as the science itself. The big pharma company then uses its massive balance sheet and enormous cash reserves to fund the hyper-expensive phase 3 trials. Once approved, they use their global army of salespeople and regulatory experts to commercialize the drug worldwide. It is a brilliant economic division of labor. The small startups take the early scientific risk, and the big conglomerates take the later stage, financial, regulatory, and execution risk. As an owner or CEO of a massive pharma conglomerate today, your job is often less about managing scientists in a laboratory and much more about managing a massive portfolio of acquisitions. You are constantly scanning the horizon, deciding which small startups to buy, negotiating multi-billion-dollar buyouts, and figuring out how to smoothly integrate their promising molecules into your massive global machine before your own patent cliff hits. So, what is the final verdict on the economics of owning a big pharma company? It is a business model defined by absolute extremes. It requires a staggering amount of upfront capital, immense patience from investors, and an iron stomach for financial risk that would destroy most other businesses. You are operating in a highly scrutinized, heavily regulated environment where the government can dictate whether your product even reaches the market and where your entire revenue stream is protected by a temporary legal shield that inevitably and predictably expires. But when the model works, when you successfully navigate the complex science, the grueling clinical trials, the FDA bureaucracy, and the labyrinth of insurance companies, the financial rewards are astronomical. You create a proprietary product with incredible profit margins that fundamentally improves or outright saves human lives, generating billions in free cash flow along the way. It is a constant, unforgiving cycle of massive financial bets, agonizing scientific failures, and world-changing blockbuster triumphs. Thank you for tuning in to this deep dive into the business of medicine. If you found this video valuable, leave a like, subscribe, and comment below which business you want me to cover next.